Hello and good morning. How's everybody doing today? This is Rich Harshaw from Monopolize Your Marketplace, and we're here for our quarterly book review webinar. And as you can see on the screen, we're going to talk about a biography of Larry H. Miller. He is the former owner of the Utah Jazz, former owner because he passed away in 2009. He's an interesting individual. And I'm pretty sure that there's that most people probably don't know this guy, maybe have heard of him, but really don't know that much about him. He's got a sort of an interesting story, and after he died, he had this book come out, so I thought I'd pick it up and see if I could pull some lessons. I first got interested in Larry Miller actually after he died when I read an article in Inc. magazine talking about some of his regrets from his life. That came out at the very end, right before he died, and we're going to talk about those in a little bit later in the webinar. But I want to start out by giving you just a little bit of an overview of who Larry Miller is, again, because most of you, I'm assuming, don't really know who he is. So just by way of very cursory overview of Larry Miller, was a kid that was brought up after World War II. He's a baby boomer of the truest measure of the word. He was born in 1944 and was brought up in Salt Lake City. He had a pretty tough upbringing. His father that he grew up with was actually a stepfather. He had been abandoned by his original dad. His mother was remarried and ended up having this sort of disposition as a kid that made him very difficult, particularly back in those days, for parents and teachers and everybody else to deal with. He was a terrible student. He never excelled in school, and the reason was that he just didn't like it. He found it to be boring. He had most assuredly what we would call ADD today, back in those days, as a lot of entrepreneurs do. But as you'll also see, his ADD was a lot different than some people's ADD in the sense that he did not have trouble focusing. In fact, focusing was a blessing and a curse for him. It really was a two-edged sword. He could focus in on something, get so hung up on it that he would neglect lots of other things, and this became a problem for him. But just a kid that was brought up in Salt Lake City, no particular promise or difference than any other kid, certainly didn't come from wealth of any kind. He actually worked as an employee until age 35. That's when he bought his first automobile dealership. He was in the automobile business for most of his adult career, from the time he got married until he was 35. Never made a whole lot of money in that business, and I'll detail some of that as we go through the discussion today. But I think it's pretty interesting to find a guy who, at age 35, had never owned his own business, who ends up becoming, a very influential, wealthy entrepreneur. But that's his story. He did make his fortune owning auto dealerships. That's where it first came from. Was very good at it, was good in the car business, ended up taking that, parlaying it into other businesses. He bought the Utah Jazz in 1985, and this is what he's really most well known for. As we'll talk about a little bit later, buying the Utah Jazz in 1985 was really not a very smart idea. He did it against all kinds of business advice. The team had lost $17 million in the 11 years that the franchise had been in Salt Lake City. They were trying to move it to another city, Minnesota, somewhere in Florida, just different groups trying to buy it and take it out of the city. And he felt like it needed to stay in Utah for pride's sake, for a rallying point for the state. And so he became committed to buying the team. And I'll talk about some of the challenges and trials he went through in buying the team. But long story short, he did buy the team, and he ended up making it extraordinarily profitable, and ended up building an arena to go with the team, and a lot of extraordinary stories that go along with that. And we'll talk about a few of them as we go through this webinar today. Ultimately, he ended up owning over 90 businesses, many of them in the automobile industry. I think he ended up with something like 43 car dealerships. But a lot of his businesses were vertically based. He had an entertainment business, and he had a car business. And in the entertainment business, he had the Jazz, of course, and he had the arena, and other affiliated businesses that were attached to entertainment. He ended up owning a car racetrack, several movie theaters. He had some real estate ventures that supported both businesses. And anyway, did very well for himself. Ended up with a fortune of over $480 million. I'm sure that if he would not have died prematurely at age 64, he probably would have become a billionaire. Died in 2009 at age 64, had some severe health problems, and that was one of his great regrets. Also, as we get into some of the warnings from his life, is that he just didn't take care of his body, and he broke down and died at a relatively young age. Unlike Steve Jobs, who also died at a young age, but he died from cancer. It was a little bit more out of his control. Larry Miller died in large part from neglecting his body, and I'll talk about that a little bit later also. But this is who Larry H. Miller is. If you go to Utah and you ask around, Larry H. Miller is quite the iconic figure in that state. Pretty much everybody knows him, regardless if they were sports fans or whatever the case was. He did a lot for that state. His can't say the word, philanthropy was very deep-seated in the state of Utah, did a lot for that state, and really sort of achieved sainthood among the people of Utah. And so they were, of course, very devastated when he died at age 64. So let's go ahead and start with, some of the lessons. There's 5 lessons that we're going to talk about. I've got a picture of him here standing in front of a Ford racing car. He had a passion for cars, not just owning dealerships, but cars themselves. He ended up collecting rare Ford Shelby Mustangs from, I believe, the 60s. I'm not that much of an expert. He ended up owning, I believe, 16 of the vehicles, valued at $250,000 to $4 million each. That was one of his indulgences that he allowed himself to purchase. Even though he was a very wealthy man, he lived a very simple life, was not the wheeler and dealer stereotype that you think of, Donald Trump or whatnot. Just kind of a simple guy, but he did have a passion for cars. And so we're going to talk about some of the lessons. I'm going to put them all on the screen here. There's 5 of them. And these are pretty generic lessons, but I'm going to give you some stories from his life that will help illustrate these and maybe hopefully can draw something out that's useful and worthwhile for your life. So let's start with hard work. This is probably not surprising. Most people that have achieved great wealth have had a penchant for hard work. I've reviewed the stories of Steve Jobs and Walt Disney on these book reviews in the past, and they were certainly no strangers to work. But this guy, I think, took it to a whole different level. And let me just give you an idea. I'm going to read a few passages from the book to give you an idea. It started out when he was really young. He had a real intense single-mindedness about him. And he says it started when he was a boy. He said they used to play marbles, not just playground marbles, but serious tournament marbles. He went to great lengths to practice and hone his skills. And he wrote this in first person, so I'll just read it in his. I'll read it in his pen, so to speak. I hiked up Capitol Hill behind my house to the police rifle range and gathered brass shell casings of all sizes, hundreds of them. I arranged the shells upright in 10 rows the width of my room. The biggest shells, the 30-06 casings, placed on the back row some 30 feet away, and the smaller 22 caliber shells in the front row. Then I shot at the shells with the marbles until I knocked all of them down. It took accuracy and power to knock shells down from that distance, especially since the marbles had to go over or through the other shells to get to the big shells on the back row. I did this every day for 3 years. I won the school marble championship and finished second in the city championship. This gives you a little bit of an idea of his intensity as a kid. He ended up becoming a very skilled softball player, and when he was an adult, you'll find out here in a minute, he worked 90 hours a week. He worked 6 days a week from sun up to past sundown, and then he would play softball and travel all around for softball tournaments all day on Sunday. And this allowed him to have an outlet, I guess, from his work, but became extraordinarily talented in softball because he had this ability to work hard. Now, let me give you an idea about his working sense. He had an experience when he was 27 years old. He'd been working in the car business for a few years. He says, I was soon to be 27 years old, married, had 2 children. One was on the way. I was responsible for supporting those children, providing food and shelter, college, housing, and much more while preparing for old age and retirement. I realized I had nothing to fall back on. I had no college education, no special training. All I had was energy and whatever talent I had been blessed with. It scared me. The feeling was so overwhelming that I stopped what I was doing to ponder the matter. I decided I had to be extremely good at something, and the thing that I was best at was being a Toyota parts manager. That night I worked until 10 p.m. It was the start of my 90-hour-a-week work schedule. From that moment on, I began working from 7:30 in the morning until 9, 10, or 11 at night, 6 days a week. I did this for 20 years. Reasoning that other dealers had the same parts and roughly the same prices to offer, I believe service and hustle were the things that would set me apart. I simply would outwork them. I would become so good that I could not be denied. I was obsessed with doing everything I could and accomplishing as much as I could. It was difficult for me to go home with work undone. I wanted to be done for the next day. A lot of people go through the motions with little sense of urgency. I had an extreme sense of urgency. A body shop would call and order 21 parts. I'd pull, pick, and price them in 15 or 20 minutes. If I could find only 19 parts, I was ticked off. If I was 5 minutes late, I was upset because I had created a system that wasn't more responsive. I became a student of everything: ordering systems, delivery systems, hiring practices, training practices, retention practices. I had decided to be incredible in all facets so that I could control the outcome. I needed to become the best. I'm going to highlight that last sentence there. I had decided to become incredible in all facets so that I could control the outcomes. I needed to become the best. Well, I wasn't just good at delivering service and parts. I was world class. I wanted parts delivered 5 minutes ago. I was a quarterback running a 2-minute offense. It produced results. When I started, the store was averaging $6,500 a month in part sales, or $78,000 a year. In my first month on the job, sales jumped to $13,000 and increased every single month for 28 months. The parts department grew so big that the dealership didn't have room to store all the parts, so we bought houses around the dealership and stored them there. In my second full year on the job, we became the first Toyota dealer in the U.S. to sell $1 million worth of parts in 1 year, an average of more than $83,000 a month, which was more than the dealership had done previously in an entire year. We were the highest volume Toyota parts dealer in the nation. We wound up selling parts in 39 states. We had a map on the wall on the ceiling. We had a map on the ceiling of the parts department. Every time we sell parts to a new place, we put a pin. Now, this is the kind of guy that he is, and you're going to find out as we go through this, as we get into the loyalty discussion. He was a hard worker, but he was screwed over many, many times, and he vowed that if he ever had his own business, which ultimately, obviously, he did, that he would not treat his people that way. And he was good to his word, and I'll talk about that in a minute. I want to just share one more story from him being a counterman to illustrate his level and commitment of work. Let's see here. He took a job for $1.10 an hour working as a counterman, and this was a job that was offered to him because he was so good at being a counterman at a different auto parts store. Somebody came in and said, hey, I'll give you a job. They hadn't been treating him right in terms of pay at his previous job, so he took $1.10 an hour. I began stocking the bins with parts, making deliveries, sweeping the floor. I got busy in the evenings and on the weekends. And then on Friday night, I observed the heavy customer traffic in the store and listened to what was happening. They had a rack of catalogs that provided numbers for each part, indicating where the parts were stored on the shelf. On Saturday mornings, there were 4 countermen, and each one had 4 or 5 people in line, and the phones were ringing. I couldn't stand it. I answered the phone and helped customers the rest of the day. I had to ask other countermen where things were, and they usually had to look things up in the catalog to find them. What I realized is that if you memorize the number system of the parts rather than look them up in a catalog, you'd be able to find things quickly and help customers more efficiently. The other guys were spending too much time looking in that catalog. Instead of having my nose buried in a catalog, I decided I would interact with people. The second thing I realized was that if I took time to study the catalogs, there were patterns that could make it easier to memorize the part numbers. So I began to memorize part numbers and their locations. Once again, I was practicing time and motion systems. I would go to bed each night and see catalog pages in my head listing fuel pumps and filters and gaskets and I couldn't shake it. It stuck in my brain like a song. I had trouble falling asleep. The Saturday crowd was always coming to the store to find a way to connect various types of copper and steel lines on fuel, brake, and hydraulic systems, say a Chevy fuel pump to a Ford fuel line. It was very difficult and frustrating for them to hook up all these parts from different manufacturers. They were always needing custom fittings, elbows, sleeves, compression fittings, flare nuts, things like that. That's when I decided to sit down and understand the different types of threads, connecting systems, elbows, and compression unions so that I could properly serve these customers. It was fun solving their problems. We had a brass fitting rack with 15 rows of drawers on it, and each of the drawers was subdivided. They contained hundreds of different parts. One day when things were slow, I got a stool out and stood in front of this rack and memorized the parts and their locations. I could see a pattern of where this stuff was. It paid off. When people came in with grease up to their elbows and frustration on their faces and asked if I knew how they could connect those parts, I was able to say, yeah, take this one, connect it to that. You need an elbow here, a compression fitting there, and you've got it. They thought I was brilliant. It was a lot of fun. I was soon working 7 days a week, every hour they were open for months. I was doing this so I could learn. It took me only a few days to realize that I liked being a counterman. It was not about cars, but about the numbers. I had been infatuated with numbers all my life, and now I was surrounded by them. Within a year, I was doing the hiring, firing, scheduling, and ordering parts. The owners who had been working bell to bell had enough confidence in me that for the first time they thought they could go home early or come in late. I was running the operation for them and was handling most of the customers. I felt it was only fair that I should be rewarded for this. I was making $1.45 an hour by now, and I felt I deserved a raise. The store had a policy which employees were given a nickel raise every 90 days. The problem was there were people who had been there longer, and they were making more money but not doing nearly as much. One day, to prove a point to the owners, I started answering every phone call and helping every customer at the counter that I could. I did this easily. After doing a little research, I discovered that I was waiting on 65% of the customers by myself, which meant that all the other employees combined were handling only 35%. I pointed this out to the owners. I told them that Gail, that was his wife, and I were about to get married. I needed a 25-cent raise. After discussing it, my employers called me into the office at the end of the day and denied my raise and explained that it would violate their raise policy. I was dejected. I believed that raises should be based on performance, not tenure. Plus, they were technically in violation of the law because they didn't pay overtime. I was working 83 hours a week. I was upset about this. That night I had dinner with this is an interesting story. Listen to this. I had dinner with my grandpa Horn, my mother's father, and he taught me a great lesson. My family had lived with Grandpa until I was 4, and as I got older, he knew about the problems I had at home when he was a teenager. He had a special way of stepping in and occasionally giving me some wise counsel. We had a special relationship. He used to take me on long drives while he was working. Let me skip to the part here that's important. Anyway, after I was denied the raise, he picked me up for dinner and asked me immediately, what's wrong? I told him nothing, but he persisted. Yes, there's something wrong, I could tell. I told him I had been rejected for the raise and how much work I was doing for the store. He sat silent a long time, thinking about this before he replied. So what do you intend to do? No matter how hard I work, I explained, I can't perform well enough to accelerate my pay, and I'm getting married. He repeated his question. Okay, so what do you intend to do about it? Well, I guess I'll only give them a $1.45 job if they're only going to pay me $1.45. Now, I don't know how old he was at this time. He was around 20. He thought about this for a few moments, and then he said, you could do exactly that and still perform at such a high level that you would outperform your coworkers. So they would never know you were giving less than you had. But you would know, and frankly, you would be the only guy to be hurt by your underperformance. So as your grandpa, I'm going to promise you that as long as you can continue to take their paycheck, if you work as hard as you can and learn all that you can in that business, someday it will pay off many times over. Well, that was a turning point for young Larry. He took his grandpa's word. He kept working as hard as he could. And as you'll see, as I transitioned into the discussion on loyalty, it did not work out for him immediately. Let me give you just a smattering of some of the times that he was not taken care of. He worked at a place called Bountiful Motors that needed a parts man. He was hired for $300 a month with the promise that if you work out, we'll pay you $350 the second month. When I opened my check for the second month, it was for $300. This upset me. I had worked out, as they put it, and when I asked management. They didn't disagree. They denied ever having made such a promise and refused to pay the extra $50. So he got another job, and people would walk in and find out how good he was, and he kept getting new jobs, but the new jobs kept screwing him over. One of the guys that came in says, I've got guys who wouldn't take the time you did to do this good of a job. I want to hire you. He promised to pay me $425 a month to work for his paint and body shop, which was called Paint and Piston. Grandpa's Horn's lesson, hard work, had borne some fruit. I had worked there for a year and liked it, but once again I needed more money. One of our customers owned a gas station called Gresh and Jerry Chevron. He offered $450 a month and said I'd only have to work 40 hours a week, Monday through Friday. That appealed to me because it would allow me to spend time with his girlfriend. So I went to work for Gresh and Jerry's doing light mechanical work, pumping gas and managing parts inventory. Almost instantly, I found myself working 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, and not being paid overtime. Now, this is a problem for those of you who are geared this way, and I want you to think about it for a minute. It's really difficult for people that are geared like this, and I know there's people on this call that are, to not put in full and maximum effort and do whatever you can regardless of the pay. This is where the entrepreneurship comes into play. It's really the only way to get paid what you're worth. One day, the general manager of Peck and Shaw GMC Toyota dealership tracked me down at Gresh and Jerry's. He called several parts shops looking for a parts guy to hire, and his name was one that had come up more than once. He offered me a job, but I turned him down. I was tired of changing jobs, and I didn't want to return to a new dealership after his bad experience at the other one. The guy persisted and convinced me to visit him at his office. He explained that he had a one-man parts operation, wanted him to oversee it, serving half a dozen technicians in the shop. I turned him down, but he showed me the parts department. It was a complete disaster, a disarray, everything piled haphazardly in boxes. Nothing was on shelves. There was no order. I saw it as enough of a challenge that it intrigued me, so I ended up taking the job. I quit Gresh and Jerry's, reminding them that they had reneged on their agreement that he would only work 40 hours a week. You're going to need to change that if you want to keep people, and that became part of his loyalty lesson, is treating people right. Well, he ended up working for the Toyota store, and long story short, they promised to pay him a certain amount, and they didn't do it. They reneged on it. And this went on and on and on. He finally got to work for a bigger dealership that said that they would pay him $650 a month plus 10% of the net profit for the parts department. They were not making a profit, but they decided that if he turned the department around, it would be worth it to pay him a percentage of the profits. He did that in the first week. His department was doing well, but overall the store was struggling. I worked there for some time before I realized I wasn't being compensated for my performance and for the profitability of the department. The owner told me repeatedly the parts department was not making a profit, but he refused to let me see the financial statement. But I knew the parts department was doing well. By accident one day, I saw the company's financial statement, and it verified what I suspected. My department was turning a profit, and they weren't rewarding it for me. I confronted the owner. He refused to pay me what I was owed. Once again, my employer didn't honor his agreement. He wouldn't pay me 10% of the net profit. So this started to be an issue with him with loyalty, and there's more stories like that. I think we've had enough there. I want to skip to some issues later on in his career when he was the owner and some of the loyalty that he displayed. I think it's quite commendable. A couple of things here. Let me get over to a different section of the book here, page 256, if you're following, which I'm sure you're not. Okay, excuse me, 285. Many years after I left Colorado, I learned that one of my old bosses, Gene Osborne, was having financial difficulties. His car dealerships had crashed and burned. Now, this is one of the guys that he had worked for. He had borrowed $7 million from a bank to recapitalize his dealership, which left him with monthly payments of $100,000 plus interest. He was struggling then, but he had money flying out the door. The expenses were for personal family problems. He also spent a lot of money. The bank, he called me and told me about his problems. I called the bank and offered them $4.5 million for the note. They refused. They called me back a few days later and asked if there was more. I said maybe, but I told them I needed to see the books first. So I sent a three-man team to look at the books of their business, both assets and liabilities. The They reported their findings to me, and I called the bankers again. I told them I would offer them this time only $3.5 million for the note instead of offering more money as they'd hoped. I was offering $1 million less. They were shocked. Yeah, but I saw the books, I told them. They were worse than I thought. You've got 4 days to accept my offers. The deadline was a Friday. On Friday at 4:58 p.m., they called to say they would accept my offer. I took over Gene's business. We had to get people in there to run them correctly. We kept paying his large house payment out of the Toyota store. And then after we finished paying off his house, we continued paying that money to him. We set him up with an auto finance business to generate some net worth so he could buy back into a dealership. We bought a dealership for him to run, a VW dealership, because Gene lived close to it. Over the years, people have asked, why did you do that for Gene? Well, what we really did was create an opportunity for Gene to build some net worth for his retirement. People viewed that as giving it to him. Let me make this really simple. If it weren't for Gene, I wouldn't be sitting here. It surprises people when I tell them that. It's about what he did to teach me in the 1970s. When I went to work for Gene in the 1970s, I was the parts manager, and Gene was part owner and general manager. Gene set me up on a pay plan that consisted of $700 a month plus 25% of the gross profit of the parts department, minus 25% of the labor of the parts department. I worked there for the first 3 months and quintupled sales, but every month there I made less money. I went to see Gene about this. I showed him the parts sales and the gross profit and what I was earning, and he said, boy, I didn't know we did that to you. We'll have to fix it. And he did. He paid me right on the spot, and he paid me retroactively. I can't tell you how refreshing this was, especially given how many times employers had cheated me previously. He made me want to work harder for him. He was loyal to his people. He lived up to his word, and he rewarded those who did a good job. Fast forward 2 years. We were having dinner to celebrate our status as the #1 parts dealer in the nation. We were at a nice restaurant, and Gene was there along with about 20 people. I said to Gene, after we became number one in the Denver metro area, you paid us bonuses. And then last year you told us if we were #1 in the nation, you'd double the bonus for all of us to $500 a person. Boy, I don't remember saying that, Gene said. Well, you said it, I said. 5 or 10 minutes later, he turned around and said, did I really say that? Yeah. Well, then we'll pay it. Tell me what I've got to do. That's who Gene Osborne is. And that's why he went back and bailed this guy out, because this guy had treated him right. This is called loyalty. When he was an owner of the Utah Jazz, Lee Benson, who was a writer for the Deseret News, the local newspaper in Salt Lake City, wrote the following: what I admired most about him was his loyalty to his friends. After you meet him for any substantive length of time, he was your friend. Every time he opened some new venture, his basketball practice facility, his racetrack, Jordan Commons, which was a real estate development, new movie complex, he made sure I got an invitation. I don't care if you write anything, he'd say, but I thought you might like to come. You were there when we started. He was like that in every arena of his life. Most NBA owners go through coaches and front office personnel like office temps. Miller never fired anyone. Jerry Sloan, the coach of the Utah Jazz, is the longest tenured coach. He actually quit since this book was written. Is the longest tenured coach of any coach in American professional sports. Even when the Jazz slumped in the post-John Stockton and Karl Malone years, Miller never wavered in his commitment to his coach. Think about it. He stuck with the same girl since junior high school. He stuck with the same basketball players, John Stockton and Karl Malone, and promised them he would never trade them, and he never did. And he eventually even set them up with their own car dealerships. He stuck with the same employees, and they stuck with him. At the time of Miller's passing, he had 12 employees who each worked for him at least 25 years, clerks, executives, parts managers, controllers, office managers, claims officers, including some who were there when he started his business in 1979. There would be more, except many of them had died or retired. Part of this was because Miller hated change, but he also had a deep sense of loyalty and gratitude to those who helped his company succeed. Another story, after Frank Layden decided to step down as the head coach of the Utah Jazz, he was the coach when he first took over, they could have easily said goodbye, says Layden, and that's the normal procedure in the NBA. But Miller, ever loyal, asked Layden to stay with the team. He named him team president. It was an honorary position. says Layden. I didn't do much. I was out front doing a lot of speaking engagements and luncheons, meet the public, and TV work, sitting in on some meetings every now and then. I'd be involved in some decisions. I was a roving ambassador. It was a nice job, and I was paid very well. Larry appreciated what I had done. He was very loyal to me. All those years I was coach and general manager, we were losing, and I never worried about my job. I was paid well and treated with great respect. Okay, let's talk about persistence for a minute. His first car dealership was in 1979. Buying that was not easy. He was 35 years old. I'd worked for car dealerships most of my adult professional life, and just like that, on April 6, 1979, I bought a car dealership for $3.5 million. Well, that wasn't necessarily an easy thing for him to do. He went to his wife that night and said, "What would you say if I told you I spent $1 million today?" "I didn't know we had $1 million, she said. "Actually, we only had $88,000 saved. It's ironic now, but no banks would loan me money. Utah banks wouldn't give me a loan because I lived in Colorado, and my money was in Colorado, and Colorado banks wouldn't give me a loan because the business was in Utah. To help finance the deal, I called my Uncle Reed Horn to be my partner, and he borrowed $200,000 from a bank to help finance the transaction. He had seen what I was able to do at the dealership, so it wasn't much of a leap of faith. I put down $20,000 in earnest money, signed over 2 of my Shelby Cobras as collateral." He loved those cars. "I had no credit. I couldn't get a conventional loan, but the sellers were motivated, and I took 3 notes with them due in 10 years. We were leveraged to our eyeballs. If you go by the book, you're not supposed to be leveraged more than 1-to-1 debt to cash, although banks and manufacturers might go 2-to-1. I was leveraged at 40-to-1. His wife was nervous, as you can imagine, but she never expressed it. She never nagged me. I was willing to take the risk, and so was she. I was betting on myself. The dealership was underperforming badly. I knew I could take a store, especially a Toyota store, and crank it up. The person that he bought the company from thought that they were going to outsmart us by selling most of the cars off their lot to friends at cost before we took possession of the business. We had expected something like that. We knew inventory was low anyway. Toyotas were hard to get at the time because they were selling so fast. I had enough clout with Toyota from my Denver days that I was able to arrange a shipment of cars and store them at the railroad yard until we took over the dealership. We opened on May 1st, and I sold 172 new cars the first month at a dealership that had been averaging 30 per month. We never looked back. On January 1st, well, that's a different part of the story. He had some pretty interesting experiences that year. Starting that year, he had made a commitment to be more financially responsible, to pay his tithing at church, which he had not done before. On February 17th, he got demoted from his job. On April 6th, he bought a car dealership, and by May 31st, he had sold 172 cars and was off and running in the car business. Now, I want to tell you a quick story here as we go through this about when he bought the Utah Jazz. This was an interesting story. The Utah Jazz, like I said, had been losing money, $17 million lost in 11 years since the franchise had come to Salt Lake City. And the owner wanted to keep the business in Utah, but had offers from other investors in other cities that would have moved it to a different place. Well, the asking price was $8 million for half the team. And the guy wanted to sell half the team, and he needed $8 million because he had some debt that he needed to retire. So he said to the owner, which was a guy named Battistone, he said, "If I pay you $8 million for half the team, will you agree to keep it here?" Yes. But he qualified it. Here's the problem. The NBA's Board of Governors meets in 9 days, on April 12th, to approve transactions. You have until April 11th at 5 p.m. to raise your $8 million. In other words, if there was going to be an ownership change that year, it had to be approved by the deadline or wait another year, and the Jazz could not wait another year. The team needed money right now. The reason Battistone agreed to accept my offer, which was considerably less than the offer to move the Jazz out of the state, was, again, because he wanted the Jazz to remain in Utah also. He didn't want to undertake financial risks. I'm going to skip that. After we agreed to the deal in the hall, Sam was the other half owner, returned to the meeting and explained my offer to the other buyer. I set out that very minute to raise $8 million. Now, here's what you need to know. His net worth at the time was $4 million, and he needed to raise $8 million in cash. Not easy to do. He went to 4 banks, Zions, First Security, American Savings and Loan, and FMA More Financial. I asked each of them for $2 million, but suggested to Zions and First Security I might need $4 million each as a backup plan because I was less certain than that the other 2 banks would give them loans. They both said they would consider the request for $2 million. They stood their ground and convinced me that that was all the money I could expect from them. I met with Zions Bank on the morning of day 1 of my 9-day countdown. I walked into the room and faced 18 Zions officials. The eyes were all on me. They knew why I was there. I felt like I was walking a gauntlet when I walked between those bank officers to reach Roy's desk. What can we do for you? I'm here to borrow money to save the Jazz. Do you have a business plan to turn them around? He knew the business had lost $17 million in 11 years and never less than $1 million in a given year. That's what I do as an entrepreneur, I said. Then he warmed me up for the next question. I told these gentlemen I would ask this question. We may base our answer on your response. I had no idea what was coming. With all the history the Jazz have as a losing proposition on one hand, and your success as a businessman in your ventures on the other hand, we have 2 different perceptions, one of a successful Larry Miller and one of a crazy Larry Miller for attempting this. Which perception is right? His response? Only history will tell. It felt like a simple reply, perhaps too simple, but it was the first thing that came to mind. Simmons, the loan officer, put his hands behind his head and started laughing. What's so funny? Was that funny? No, but I suggested to the people in this room that I would ask this question, and I couldn't think of an answer you could give me that would garner my support, but you just gave it to me. So they committed $2 million. He had that on the first day. He found it very difficult to get the other money. By the 3rd day, First Security had committed $2 million, which meant he now had half the money. On day 7, American Savings called to say that they rejected our loan request. I returned to the 4th bank and tried to get a decision. I'd repeatedly called the loan official, but he kept putting me off. Then day 8 arrived. Remember, 9 days to a deadline. I was in panic mode. I called his house repeatedly. His 11-year-old daughter answered the phone. I continued to call his house over and over. No one would answer the phone, not even his daughter. Finally, at 11 o'clock, the loan officer answered the phone, explained that he'd been unable to find the phone. His daughter had put it in the refrigerator so she wouldn't have to hear the calls anymore. I told Rich I needed an answer, but he didn't have one. I told him I knew that the loan committee was meeting with shareholders the next morning. I also knew that they were going to have breakfast before the meeting at 7 o'clock. I told him I was going to crash the breakfast. The next morning, day 9 out of 9, I walked into the room where the group was having breakfast. It was embarrassing, but I had to do it. I had no other option. There was a dozen men in the room sitting at breakfast, some of whom recognized me, others didn't. Look, I'm sorry to crash your breakfast, I told them, but I need a decision from you, and I need it right now. I know this is presumptuous of me, but I'm out of options. This is an awesome story. One of the bank officials stood up and asked me to come with him, leading me out of the room. We'll find a way to help you, he said. We're trying to find out how to do it right now. This is one of the things that we're talking about this morning. Don't go away. That meant I collected $6 million, but it was day 9, and I only had a few hours to get the rest. By now, the media was on to this story. I went back to American Savings and asked and told them that I needed the money. He said, we've been embarrassed by the news story and the coverage that we didn't lend you the money. We'll give you $1 million. I was relieved by this news, but of course it meant I was still $1 million short. I went back to Zions and First Security to ask for $1 million, but they wouldn't budge. At 3 o'clock, I received a phone call from the team president. Are you going to get the money or not? He asked. I told him I didn't know. Well, we've got a problem. Tonight we play Portland at home at the Salt Palace. We're having a reception and dinner for 300 people, and we need you to make an announcement that you're buying half the team. The media will be there. We've got to know. He continued to call me throughout the afternoon to check my progress. I couldn't give him an answer, and 5 o'clock was getting closer and closer. At 3:30, I got on the phone again and urged all 4 lenders to meet for the first time to explore ways to come up with the last $1 million. They met on the 10th floor of the First Security building behind glass doors that allowed me to see but not hear what they were saying. I was in the lobby pacing, watching nervously. They're making notes and talking. I was still getting phone calls from the team president, glancing at my watch. It was 4:40. We had 20 minutes to figure this thing out. I couldn't take it. I walked into the meeting. Fellas, I'm not trying to ruin your meeting, but I'm going to tell you something. I've been paying my own bills. Now think about this from a reputation standpoint. I've been paying my own bills since I was 12 years old. I've never missed a payment on anything in my life. If you can find a delinquent payment, turn me down. If you can't, make this loan. I've got to make an announcement in 18 minutes. At 4:53, 7 minutes before the deadline, they said, we'll work out the details. Go to your meeting and tell them it's done. And with that, they decided that First Security came up with another $700,000. Zions came up with another $300,000. When he woke up on day 9, he only had half the money. Somehow, it all came together at the last minute. This is persistence in Larry Miller, okay? Let's move on to fairness, a trait that was positive in Larry Miller. And let me go here. Oh, gosh, page 251. There's an interesting story in here. How much time do we have? We've got a little time. 251. This was a controversy that you may have heard of, even if you're not familiar with Larry H. Miller. This is back in 2006, I believe, and it was a controversy that stemmed from a movie theater that he owned. So here's what happened. I woke up in the middle of the night thinking about it. I kept replaying the situation in my mind. Sleep was impossible. The Brokeback Mountain controversy, the one that made me the butt of jokes for late-night talk shows and hosts, including Jay Leno, not to mention the target of boycotts and hate mail in the center of a national debate, had become a weight on my shoulders. I went downstairs and wandered into our living room. I looked out the large window that overlooked the Salt Lake Valley with rows of lights. The piano was nearby, and for some reason I reached for the hymn book that lay there and opened it to the hymn, How Firm a Foundation. The spring of 2006 was a difficult time for me. The only reason I'm revisiting the Brokeback Mountain controversy is not to restate my position or defend myself or apologize or waffle on my original position, although I would do things differently now. I revisit this mostly because I want to discuss what happened afterwards, and to do that I must return briefly to the genesis of the controversy. I'm not going to read the whole story, but here's what happened. He had a movie theater. The movie came out, Brokeback Mountain, and it was a movie about homosexual cowboys. They normally have a protocol to screen movies, and he would not put movies in his theater that were against his personal morals. And there was a lot of movies that they would reject. Let's see what he said. Yeah, it says they have a gatekeeper, and if the gatekeeper finds something objectionable, he simply does not procure that movie. When Brokeback Mountain came out, by the time I had heard about the movie, it had already been booked by our theaters and advertised an upcoming attraction. Our movie procurer had recently died, but we have an internal guy who's supposed to be a gatekeeper as well. He should have caught it, and he simply declined to procure this movie, and then it never would have been an issue. We pass up hundreds of movies, and no one says anything. When I learned about the subject of the movie, I pulled it. In my world, and with my beliefs, I figured enough is enough. I'm taking a stand. It's as simple as that. Well, it started a nationwide controversy. There were calls from gay and lesbian groups to boycott my business, ignited long debates on talk radio and newspaper forums. It got really ugly. But something good grew out of all of this. About the same time, I was asked by the University of Utah, via Jim Wall, the Deseret News publisher and chairman, to speak at the university for their what was called U-Days celebration. It was part of an ongoing effort by the university to become more integrated with the community. After Brokeback Mountain turned into a heated controversy, the university began to catch flack from gay and lesbian groups for inviting me to speak. They started an internet boycott campaign against my speaking engagement. They circulated petitions demanding that the U withdraw its invitation in protest. Gail, his wife, read the petition online and was surprised at some of the people who had signed it. She didn't tell me all the names because she believed it would be too hurtful to me. Some were people I had donated money to. Seeing all the trouble this was causing, I called Michael Young, the university president, and told him, hey, I don't want to cause you any problems. You can uninvite me. It's not a problem. But President Young dug in his heels. He said no one would dictate who spoke at the U. I finally told him, well, let me meet with them. A meeting was arranged. The U invited representatives from various gay and lesbian student groups and faculty members. I met with them on campus. Greg, his oldest son, and Gail came with me as symbolic gesture, the traditional family solidarity, and so forth. Gail said, I'm not going to let you go in there alone. To start the dialogue, I simply said, and here's the key thing. He said, I said to them, I want to hear what you're feeling. What have I done to hurt you? I wanted to listen and learn from what they had to say. To their credit, they were willing to discuss the issues openly. It was refreshing to them that I was willing to come onto their turf and just listen to them. What I learned is that while taking a stand for what I believed, I had hurt many sincere people. I deeply regretted that. It was never my intention. I had always been a guy who stood up for the underdog. I was the kid who fended off the snowball attack on my underdog classmate in grade school. And here, I had hurt a whole group of underdogs. As I listened to the abuse they had endured and how they believed that my actions had contributed to it, I was surprised. I was moved. I felt great empathy. It was a great and remarkable 2-hour meeting. I learned a lot. It turned into a mutual admiration club. Instead of protesting my speech the next day, they showed up and listened. They had previously threatened to wear cowboy hats to protest the Brokeback Mountain Cowboys. Only a few came with their hats, but instead of wearing them, they held them in their hands in what I interpreted as a sign of respect. I gave my speech about the rewards of investing in higher education, something I think we had demonstrated in the previous day's meetings. Yes, I would do it differently. I would either not procure the movie and not discuss it, or if we had booked it, I would have gone ahead and run it because we were showing worse movies than that. Hostel, for instance. People assume I'm retracting my position. I'm not. But I would not intentionally hurt someone unnecessarily. Even my own secretary was upset. I regret that I caused people pain or made their life more difficult. Now, this story is very powerful to me, personally. And I'll tell you why. Because I share a lot of the same values as Larry Miller. I belong to the same church, the Mormon Church, and some of the values that he has are the same values that I have in terms of family and in terms of strengthening the family and all those kinds of things. And this was a powerful story for me to take a look through somebody else's perspective. And what he did is, it says, he sat down with them and said, I just want to know what you're feeling. And he took the time to have the empathy. The author of the book, he wrote this book, but he also wrote it with another guy that helped him write some stuff. And I just want to tell you what they said about this. He didn't go in there to make statements or defend himself, said Jim Wall, who witnessed the meeting. It was obvious he was there to listen. He wanted to find out what he had done to offend them. He wanted to understand them. One of the things he learned is that these people suffer a lot of ridicule and prejudice. People throw popcorn at them in theaters or snicker at them. They feel persecuted. They said that when Larry pulled the movie, it was as if he endorsed that bad behavior. Larry said, I had no idea you're being persecuted. I had no intention to endorse bad behavior. I'm sorry that happened to you. I have my beliefs, and they're pretty well founded in marriage between a man and a woman to propagate the human race. I disagree with your lifestyle, but I don't tell you that you can't live it. He didn't talk as much as he listened. He was emotional. He got teary-eyed, and he spoke to them as he listened to their stories. A genuine discovery occurred. A lot of bad feelings melted away. He never compromised his values, but he was empathetic, and he listened. It was a perfect example of diverse, opposite points of view coming together in a dialogue which both sides were hurt, and neither side moved, but both sides understood each other better and really could have differences of opinions without being confrontational. Many expressed their appreciation to him for speaking to them. Before we left the meeting, one of the faculty leaders said, I'm coming to your speech, and I'm going to bring my hat, but I'm not going to wear it. You know, in the end, the university received unintended benefit of having Larry speak. Students learned that this is the way to handle differences of opinion without being confrontational. If someone throws water on you, what do? Instead of getting mad, you ask them why they're mad. Dialogue is different from confrontation. Okay, well, let's move on. Let's talk briefly about money. This is an interesting topic with Larry Miller. Let's go to a couple pages in the book here. Okay, page 233 for my notes. He had an experience when he was newly married. His son got sick, had to go to the hospital, needed 2 operations, and had a $3,000 medical bill, which in those days was just mammoth. It was more than they could bear. So his financial situation was tight. He'd been changing jobs, as I'd already mentioned, and they moved to Colorado, like I also already mentioned, to take another job. They took $3,000 in debt and then added a mortgage of $24,800. Now, think about that just for a second. The medical bill was $3,000. The mortgage on his house was $24,000. That gives you a little bit of perspective on how much medical bill that was. Let's say that that house now would be $248,000 instead of $24,800. That means the medical bill was equivalent now of maybe $30,000, a lot of money. They devised a plan to pay off the $3,000 medical bills. We listed all of our bills on a sheet of paper, starting with the biggest debt, working to the smallest. Each month we paid off a certain amount toward each of them. As the smallest debts were paid off, the money that would be applied to the next smallest debts the following month. It was a slow progress. I finally figured out a way to pay off the balance of our debts. Someone brought an old Land Cruiser to our dealership. I bought it for $800, and in my spare time I fixed it up and eventually sold it for $2,500, which I used to pay off the balance of the debts. We were debt-free. After that, Gail and I vowed to never go into personal debt again. We wanted to be in control of our own destiny. We didn't like being at someone else's mercy. We didn't take loans or use credit cards. If we didn't have the money for something we wanted, we just didn't buy it. It was that simple. To obtain financial independence, I decided that whenever I was given a raise in my salary, instead of increasing my standard of living, I saved it. The mistake many people make is that when they get pay increases, they buy boats, fancy cars, bigger houses, designer clothes, or exotic vacations, so they never get ahead. They're earning more money, but they're increasing their expenses, so they merely maintain that. So that's kind of how he lived his life. When we got married, we lived frugally. Our honeymoon, we stayed in cheap hotels, bought our food at the grocery store, fixed sandwiches while we drove home. We didn't spend money. We didn't have a power mower for years. We owned one of those old-fashioned hand mowers with the twirling blades, powered by sweat. We stayed in the same house, 1,700 square feet, for 4.5 years, remaining there even after we had 4 kids. We didn't landscape for years because we couldn't afford it. We had no lawn. Our yard was dirt and weeds, so you couldn't see kids when they were playing out there. We finally laid 10,000 square feet of sod doing the work ourselves. A friend of mine who was a banker saw our home and our large family and came and took us to see houses. He showed us a $35,000 home. We considered it way over our heads. In reality, we could have afforded it, but we just didn't feel right. I advise people not to change their standard of living as their income increases. Protect the base. It's tattooed on my brain. I still won't spend $60 for a meal at a restaurant. We eat at restaurants that have good food but are cheap. $15 for a meal is about my limit. Gail still shops at Costco and buys things on sale. It's just ingrained in her. If she buys something nice, it's the exception. I drive what most would consider a normal car. That's intentional. I don't want to convey ostentatious or attract attention. Besides, I'm high risk for death threats, so I'm careful too. It was never a temptation to change my standard of living. I didn't need anything better than what I have. I didn't buy fancy clothes, as everyone who knows me can attest. I could afford Armani, but that wouldn't be me. I just wouldn't be comfortable. My uniform is golf shirts, sneakers, jeans, or khaki. And then he talks about that. Interestingly, he did end up, here's what he says. Through the years, as my wealth grew beyond any of my wildest expectations, I could afford to buy things. I still spent money sparingly, with 2 notable exceptions: my Cobras, Shelby Cobras, and our current home. I have always been determined not to let money change me, and I hope I achieve that. For me, money was a means to an end, not the end in of itself. When he died, in an interview with the Deseret News, here's what it says. As I sat in the Miller house with Gail, she placed her late husband's wristwatch, wedding ring, and wallet on the table in front of me. Do you notice anything about them, she asked. The ring is a plain gold band, which he liked to tell people Cost $22, and the watch was a nondescript $100 Seiko with a worn leather wristband. He wore the same watch for years, changing only the band when it began to crack. He didn't buy a new wallet until the stitching fell out of the old one. He wanted to keep grounded and remember where he came from, not put on airs. He made a conscious effort to remain the same. Okay, this is an interesting approach, especially for somebody worth so much money. I think it's interesting. I want to bring out one more point here on money. Oh gosh, where is this? Well, just one more thing on that. On several occasions, Larry would get on his wife for buying expensive apples. So one day she snapped, "I think we could afford apples." Even the sneakers Larry wore were discounts. Rather than buy his own, he wore ones that were sent free to jazz players. He could have afforded to fly first class. He flew coach instead. With all of his wealth, what did he buy? Nothing. His wife said he never bought anything. Actually, he did buy a softball mitt for $64, which was the most extravagant thing he purchased for himself. His idea of splurging was a water pick. He owned 250 shirts in his closet, most of them polo shirts with jazz emblem on it. He could have worn a different shirt every day for a year, but he usually only wore a few of his favorites. Okay, let's move on here. Let's talk just briefly about how he treated others with money. There was an endless array of projects that drew Miller's interest: time, money, including an estimated $50 million he donated to Salt Lake Community College to construct the South Valley campus that bears his name. $10 million he gave to Huntsman Cancer Institute. $10 million endowment he gave to a project called the Joseph Smith Papers, which was a project in conjunction with Brigham Young University to document some of Joseph Smith's writings, who's the founder of the Mormon Church. Much of what Miller did related to charity was related to education, arts, and business. He provided financial assistance and extensive tutelage to numerous people who wanted to fix or start a business. There are hundreds of small businesses operating in Utah today whose owners were taught and received encouragement and guidance from Larry H. Miller. Miller funded movies that he wanted to see on the screen because they were personal projects of his. One of them was called The Work and the Glory, that documented early Mormon pioneer situations. He lost $18 million on that. He had a weakness for the arts. I can't find that. Anyway, he donated lots and lots of money. But some of the stories in here are very interesting. They weren't about donating $10 million to this or $20 million to that. It was about individuals that he would be very kind and generous with on an individual level. Whether it was helping pay off somebody's mortgage or medical bills, it was something that he did all the time. So anyway, there's some good information for you on Larry Miller. Let's talk a little bit about the, if I can get my mouse to work here. Let's talk a little bit about the lessons, the warnings: family, health, and micromanagement. Now, let's talk about family. This is where I started my story with him. Is I had read an article in Inc. magazine right after Larry Miller died. They had done sort of an obituary type of a story talking about some of his achievements. And his son, Greg, who took over the jazz and the dealerships and the business after his dad died, made a comment that said basically, my dad was always gone. I never had a relationship with him. It took him getting sick and to the point of death to where he finally had a relationship with me. The last 6 months of his life were the best 6 months ever. I finally felt like I had a dad. And that's a pretty pathetic thing for a grown man to have to say about his dad. So let's talk about this. I worked every waking hour. Initially, it was fear that drove me to work 90 hours, overwhelming feeling that being responsible for the needs of wife and children, not having a college degree. I worked when other people were home watching TV or sleeping or eating breakfast. I was getting the next day's work done a day early. I was sleeping about 6 hours a night. It made me successful, but it also made me a failure. I missed most of my children's youth. I missed ball games and science fairs and back-to-school nights. I missed the first day of kindergarten playing catch in the yard. I missed dinner at home with my wife and kids. Gail had to do everything. She was basically a single parent with our 5 children. I didn't take any time off. I worked all the time. I played 6 days a week. I worked 6 days a week, and on the seventh day, Sunday, I played softball. As Gail likes to say, I didn't go to my kids' ball games. They came to mine. Even when I was at home, I wasn't really there. Greg, our oldest child, said he learned when the door to my office at home was shut, you didn't open it. And if the door was ajar and you entered at your own peril. Hang on one second. The kids were in bed when I got home from work. The only time I saw them was at church on Sunday or at my softball games. Gail said we raised our children at the ballpark. It was part of her effort to put the kids and me together. When they were young, Gail would bring them to the dealership in the evening. We'd go to dinner, then afterwards they dropped me back at work again. When the kids were 12, I started giving them jobs at the dealership, a way to just at least let them be around me. This remarkable woman that he married put up with that. I'm not sure how she put up with that, but she did. And I'm not going to dwell on this. I think it's fairly clear. It didn't help his family. And his health also suffered. If you look at pictures of Larry Miller, he was not what you would call a skinny man. He was portly. His developed diabetes. He was so dedicated to his work, though, that he didn't eat properly to manage his diabetes. Diabetes is a disease that has to have a certain type of food and sugars and so forth, and he just didn't do it, and it ended up killing him. When he got into his 60s, his diabetes got really bad. His heart was not good. Speech started going bad. Circulation got bad. They ended up amputating his legs below the knees. That didn't work out. The legs continued to blacken on the back. He started to lose his fingers. They had to amputate, and by the time he was done, the guy was just a mess. And he says in the book, look, I didn't take care of myself. I didn't eat right. I didn't exercise. I never exercised. After I quit playing softball, I never got any exercise at all. I didn't eat right, and he basically killed himself with work and with unhealthy lifestyle. And this is pretty sad, considering you have a guy that didn't drink or smoke or do drugs or any of the typical unhealthy things, but he did just work and eat himself into a grave, literally at age 64. In terms of micromanagement, just one little thing to end this up, and then we'll be done here. Let's see. He says, I thrived and worked on the details. Instead of delegating as I should have, I dived into the minutia of every project we ever undertook, even amid the great concerns about deadlines and costs and architectural issues when we were building the Delta Center, which was the basketball arena. I was involved in every aspect of the project, even the window blinds and the type of concrete block we would use. I drove around town for hours trying to find a building that used a certain type of concrete block before finding it at the airport. I had to get security clearance just to look at the concrete. I worked for weeks to research what types of trees we should plant in front of the arena. I bought books on the subject. I consulted horticulturists. I drove around town to see what various trees looked like when they were mature. I became an expert on trees. What CEO of a billion-dollar company does this? I was that intense about everything. We built dozens of buildings, and I was the one deciding on the floor plan and the paint and the color of the carpet and so forth. I could have delegated these jobs to any of our thousands of employees, but I took pleasure in the details. I liked to make sure it was done right. I liked the sense of accomplishment and learning new things. Each time I took on a new project, I immersed myself in some new field and became expert at it. I can tell you the craziest things, such as how many Christmas lights it takes to decorate a tree in front of the arena, or how many yards of concrete we poured in the building. In the arena project, I attended daily meetings with architects and learned to make as much as I learned the trade as much as I could. I pretty much became knowledgeable. During those meetings, I requested certain things would be done with construction of the building, and architects would tell me it couldn't be done. I'd tell them, if you look at your drawings and reconfigure your plans, I think you'll see that it can be done. The next day they would show up and say, you know what, you're right. He goes on later to lament that this was a mistake, and he goes back to this example of the trees in front of the arena, and he says, you know what, I spent probably 100 hours researching and learning about trees so we could put the right trees in front of the arena, but we had people on my staff that could have easily made that decision in minutes because they knew. He said, but I didn't talk to them, I ignored them, and I wanted to know myself. He says, that's 100 hours on trees that I could have spent with my family or on anything else that I'll never get back. And this is one of the downfalls of his life and one of his regrets as he got into older age and found that he was going to die. You know, it just became a sad point for him. Anyway, this is a good book. If you have an opportunity to get it, and read it. I recommend it. And let me tell you why. This book was very, very easy to read. It was written by both Larry Miller himself and by Doug Robinson. It was written in an interesting format where Larry would write a chapter in first person on a given topic, and then Doug Robinson would come in at the end of the chapter and put a postscript and give his perspective on that topic based on what he knew about Larry Miller. And Larry Miller had invited him to do this. It was a collaborative project that they worked on before he died. So it's really easy to read. Larry Miller writes things very straightforward. It's simple to understand. The lessons are clear. You don't have to really try that hard to pick out the good stuff. It's all good stuff. And I think there's a lot of good lessons to be learned in there. There's some other elements in here that we didn't really touch on. His faith was a big issue with him. He had some issues and problems with it when he was younger. He came back stronger to it when he became an adult and entrenched in his career and certainly into his older age, and it really affected the way that he conducted himself and his business. But those elements are found in the book. So if you've got time and you have an interest, I'd strongly recommend the book. It's called Driven. If you haven't figured that out by now, it's a play on words. The man made his fortune in the car business. He was extraordinarily driven to have that success. And that's what I've got for you on the topic of Larry H. Miller. Hopefully you enjoyed that and found something worthwhile in it. And I guess we'll talk to you next time. I think we'll be back with you next week for a Tuesday morning ad clinic. Till then, have a great week. Bye now.
The organizer has